You know bank deposit rates? They are high now, right? But what about for inflation? They are even higher, correct? So the question is, what if you want to retire with just bank deposits in this high inflation environment? Can it be achieved? Now before we get there, let me break down today's whole discussion into two key parts. Firstly, you'll be hearing what kind of numbers exactly are coming out in terms of a high inflation environment. And second, I'll touch on the exact numbers on how much you might need as well as how much you can withdraw if you have a full retirement pot. Now let's start with the high inflation environment we are in right now. This over here is Singapore's inflation rate. You see that in the last few months, it's at 7.5%, correct? This is the CPI all-inclusive index, which means it includes also services, food, energy costs and stuff. And as you can see in hawker centers and in petrol pumps, all this cost is escalating. And if you add on rent and property prices, this number is self-explanatory why it's so high. But the curious part is if you use 7.5% and extrapolate forever for retirement, this is not likely also going to be the right approach, because if you see in terms of history, you realize that using US data for many years, referencing back to 1980s, you would see that inflation has actually reached before 15%, correct? And at the point of time, you realize that lasted for a few years. And what we can see from previous inflation cycles is that after it peaks, it will normalize downwards. And the usual normalized factor is about 3 to 5%, thereabouts. So this time round, where would inflation eventually peak? No one knows for sure. It could be 15% again. But the key point is that inflation also goes in cycles because government is trying to combat it. It's not good for the economy. But the curious part is before October 2021, there wasn't that much hype about inflation. Let me pull up some data for you to see. This is actually a collection of inflation reading across the last few years. You see that the annualized reading for 2021 was a meager 2.3% only, and COVID period it was negative, which means deflation. But before COVID, surprisingly, it was only at 0.5% thereabouts, correct? This is actually a CPI or inflation index again. But what exactly contributed to this sudden jump in terms of inflation starting from October 2021? I went to dig out data and actually found this surprising graph declared by MAS. You can see that the pink graph over there highlights certain increasing costs, and the pink graph relates to private transport. As we know, COVID period, private transport fell. Nobody was going to offices. But then right now, everybody is going back to offices. And not just that, there's a short supply of labor in terms of the private transport sector. That's why cost is inflating, and they're also passing on to customers increased energy costs. Then what are other contributing factors? They include the green bar over there, which is actually accommodation. If you have been following news, you might have seen that rental rates are surging through the roof, correct? So that adds on to accommodation cost also. Then what are other contributing factors to increase in CPI? That includes food. But when we mention CPI all items, it's not just the essential foods. It's actually eating in restaurants and non-essential places. And this is actually getting expensive because I go to restaurants and nowadays they don't quite run promotions already. So I can see the inflation adding on to my each and every restaurant bill. So the $1 million question is, where are we right now in terms of this inflation cycle? What to expect for 2023? Is it going to be substantially higher than what we're seeing right now? Thankfully, there's good news. I actually found some information on MAS website. It's mentioned over here that MAS core inflation will likely hover around 5% for the rest of 2022 and into early 2023. But they believe that second half of 2023 will see some cost pressures gradually easing. In terms of projections, MAS core inflation should come in at 3.5 to 4.5% only for 2023, and CPI all items inflation will be 5.5 to 6.5%. Now if you compare that to current core inflation at 5.3% and CPI all items at 7.5%, this is definitely a decline, correct? So that's definitely good news. And there are more data points to show you. Now, inflation is driven a lot by travel and discretionary goods and services. But on the right hand side of this graph, you realize that the underlying MAS core inflation momentum is dropping. There's a peak experienced already and it's a downward momentum in terms of the inflation growth. Good news, correct? But how does that answer our question today? Can you retire with just bank deposits in high inflation environment? To answer this question, we need to dissect it into three key parts. The first is, what is our inflation assumption when we do retirement planning? The second is, what is our long-term assumption of bank deposit rates? And last but not least, how big is that savings pot parked into deposits? Now let's start with the first one. What is long-term CPI inflation? Is 4% conservative in terms of planning? Because just now we've seen the MAS suspects CPI all items inflation to come down to 5.5 to 6.5, and certainly there will be some normalization cycle because we've studied history and inflation goes in cycles. In that case, CPI full lump sum is only inflating at 3.5%. Could current period now of high inflation at 7.5% just be a bad period, just an outlier? That's something to consider. Then the second part of the equation, what is our assumption for long-term bank deposit rates? Now you know bank deposit rates react to global interest rate news, reacts to inflation data. So it drives. Inflation goes up, global interest rates goes up, bank deposit rates goes up. So you see in September, people are thinking 2.7% for fixed deposit seems like a steal. They went to queue up for 4 hours, and lo and behold, what we realized in November, every bank is offering 3+% in terms of rates really. That's how fast interest rates have been climbing. So now that 2.7% looks like peanuts. Even high interest accounts that I use myself are also revising up their interest rates. OCBC 360 account have bumped up their interest rates they're giving to depositors. And just as a note here, for retirees, you realize that there's no salary crediting, correct? It becomes very hard to squeeze high interest from such accounts. How about exploring our new digital bank, Trust Bank? Over here, you realize that they've also increased their base interest. And under Trust Bank, it's quite simple to clock 1.5% plus 0.5% if you're a non-NTUC Union member. For 2%, no need to deposit any salary, and you can actually earn this for your first $75,000. I'm a user of Trust platform, and if you haven't signed up one, look for my referral links below. And it draws to this key part. When inflation data subsides, interest rates will start to reduce, correct? Bank deposit rates, they would likely drop back down again, correct? Maybe not to previous year's level of 1% thereabouts, maybe 2% or 1.5%. We cannot assume bank deposit rates to be higher than the long-term CPI inflation. That doesn't quite make sense, because if bank deposits can beat inflation, it's risk-free, then every depositor is just becoming more and more wealthy. That doesn't make sense. So what is the real number that we should put for long-term bank deposit rates? Is it 2%? Or if you are a bit more optimistic, maybe 3% long-term bank deposit rates? Because if you see in terms of Singapore savings bonds, you realize that you can lock in 10 years at 3.47% average return. However way we look at it, I think it's more prudent to assume the CPI long-term rates to be higher than the bank fixed deposit rates. And if this is 4% and if this is 3%, you realize that the monies are lost to inflation. This is also called a negative inflation adjusted return. There's actually a proper calculation to it, and if we put return rate at 3% for bank deposits and inflation rate at 4%, you would get a negative 0.96%. That doesn't mean that it's a loss in terms of money. It's just that every year when you draw up money, you need to draw up more and more. But what you earn in terms of interest cannot cover the increased drawing out amounts. Confused about it? Let me put some numbers for you to see. If you have a $1 million pot and you want to draw $40,000 each year, which is $3,333 per month. This year draw $3,333 per month. Next year you draw $3,467 per month because 4% inflation rate, correct? How long can that $1 million last? Let me give you the quick answer with this inflation adjusted return. That $1 million pot can only last for 22 years. Now let's put some context to 22 years. I actually dug up an old survey by Manulife. They've mentioned that pre-retirees are aiming for $1.1 million. For pre-retirees, is this 22-year runway too short in terms of full retirement, especially if it likely is, correct? Then what about for retirees who have actually achieved retirement savings of $599,000? Can they park their monies all into fixed deposits and start consuming it? For them, I believe that if they only know that this monies can last for 22 years, they will be quite fearful to use it. Because you never want to outlive your resources. There's that lingering fear. This is not CPF Life or any annuity that will keep paying you for life. This is your bank account depleting all the way to zero. So for these retirees, I believe they can use that 4% rule in terms of redrawing their money, especially if they park everything they have into fixed deposits. To achieve that 4% withdrawal rule, you need equity exposure. You need to acquire assets like equities or properties that technically have a positive inflation adjusted return. But it's not all gloom and doom. Let me end off this whole discussion with another solution. For retirees with $599,000 already, and you want bank deposits, you don't want to take risk. It's not your cup of tea. I get it. I actually done some calculations as to how much you can consume. Don't consume 4% of your capital each year. Don't follow the 4% rule. You probably can only consume 2.4% of your capital. And this will allow you to stretch your total retirement pot to last 35 years instead of just 22 years. Which means for $5,999, you can draw $1,200 per month with a 4% inflation factor. Which means next year, you can draw $1,248. And if you follow this formula and put everything in bank deposits, you can sleep safe on it. You can also count on the fact that this money can last you for 35 years. Whether it's long enough or not really depends on your age as well as your life expectancy really. Hopefully I've given you enough numbers to clear away certain doubts and allay some fears. In any case, I always still encourage to have equity exposure even in retirement. There's a place I believe builds wealth and also preserves wealth. And maybe this tutorial can elaborate even further on what I'm thinking of. This is a what-if situation as a retiree if you park all your monies into equity. What is the consequence of it and how can we actually solve it? If you're curious about it, check that out also. I think it has nuggets of wisdom. And as always, if you'd like to do a full retirement planning on a one-to-one basis, look for my links below. And I'll be glad to assess whether it's a case that I can help with. With that, sign up from here and see you in this tutorial too. Take care as always. Goodbye.